In the last couple or few videos, we've discussed movement to contact and meeting engagement. And there was a reason I wanted to start there, because it is through the meeting engagement, which is an initial contact with an enemy force. It's through that and those conditions, through the meeting engagement and the conditions that set up the meeting engagement, that necessitate our use of the tactic movement to contact. What I mean by all that is, we use that first. Do we ever use a movement to contact second, as in a transition or follow-on tactic? And the answer is, you bet. I'm Dr. Christopher Larsen, a veteran of the U.S. Army Infantry, founder of One Shepherd Leadership Institute, and author of Small Unit Tactical Doctrine. Once again, we're going to talk about larger tactics and tactical operations in which we might use the movement to contact. In fact, I'm going to say that almost invariably, we will use the movement to contact. I'm going to show you here that we don't just use movement to contact when we're seeking the initial engagement with the enemy, but we can and often do use movement to contact when we're transitioning from, maybe a defensive operations to offensive operations, or when we're conducting follow-on tactics. Starting with counterattack. A counterattack can be executed as you attack, and then you continue your attack. That's a form of a counterattack. But more commonly, we think of it from a defensive position, and so let's talk about that first. Let's put ourselves into some kind of defensive line here. We'll say this is our FLOT, our forward line of troops, okay? And this is our battle engagement area out here. So this is where we're expecting the enemy to come and fight us. When the enemy comes in and then just does this, oh my gosh, we repel them. We've successfully repelled the enemy in the engagement area. We now have the option of conducting a counterattack. And we can do this in one of several ways. You're going to see one of the subjects near and dear to my heart is always, where's your reserve? Where's your reserve force? This is something else that U.S. commanders do very, very poorly. When they do a forward line of troops, they want 100%. Well, I need to cover too much space. I'm always given too much space. I'm always undermanned. I have 70-80% of my force here. So I'm just going to put lottie-dottie everybody on the front line of troops and leave no one in reserve. This is as common as, the sun rising in the east. It's just very, very common. And that's unfortunate because we need our reserve back here, because our reserve gives us one of, it helps us with a counterattack. We can let the reserve pass through and then do a frontal. This is called a frontal counterattack, but that passage of line here is very, very tricky when the entire FLOT is jittery because they've just taken casualties, they've just repelled a very credible enemy force, and so that's risky, a frontal attack. And so what more commonly happens is, if this is planned well, we have a flanking. We're going to go through an opening in one of our ends, and we're going to go out here and try to catch the enemy in their line of egress. You've just seen this. That's an envelopment, and you've seen this in the meeting engagement. Well, we do the same thing in a counterattack. We try to catch them there. Now, we could stop here and just say, yeah, they're going to go out there and, put a boot in the enemy's rear, right? They're not necessarily trying to destroy the enemy or capture all the enemy. They just want to hurt the enemy as much as possible as it flees. And you can do that. Of course, I would argue there are other assets rather than infantry that are better suited for this. I don't know, artillery, close air support, this sort of thing. Why risk your infantry? And it's a valid question, because we must be aware that with counterattack, throughout known written history, there have been the effort by enemies to make a believable attack, fall back from that believable attack, say over a ridgeline or over a hill where this enemy, this defense can't see. And then when the counterattack comes out, they find that it's a baited ambush. All right, the Mongolian hordes were famous for this. Draw people out of their castle. The cavalry comes out, goes over a hill, thinks that they're going to mop up a vanquished enemy, only to find out that that was just 1/3 of the enemy force. 2/3 of it sat on either side of that hill, waiting for the cavalry to come out. And that's a baited ambush. Just sending your reserve out has some risks, and it has minimal amount of damage it can do. So now we can get back into that hammer and anvil. We can commit even more. What we can say is, well, I'm going to send out my reserve in an envelopment, and then I'm going to take my entire force, or most of it anyway, if not all of it, and I'm going to pursue the enemy. Ta-da! Look at that. Now we've done a frontal counterattack and a flanking counterattack in combination. It's your whole hammer and anvil thing, right? And it was from a defensive line. So this is one way to do a counterattack. All right, that's one way to do a counterattack. It seems worth noting here that there's one other we need to talk about before we go into offensive counterattacks, and that is the defense. Let's go back into that for a second. Let's say here's our fortified defense of our flot. Here comes the enemy. The enemy attack. It's our enemy force. And they break through our line. They hit our flot and they have some success. They grab that toehold that they need through our defensive line. We can retake that gap. This is one other thing that the reserve allows us to do, is to fill a gap when our line is broken, when our defenses are broken. And oh, by the way, that's also a counterattack. So we need to know, we've shown you two types of counterattack from the defense, right? We've shown the hammer and anvil. We can do a frontal, or we can do a flanking, or we can do a combination of both. But we can also fill a gap, fill a breach, when the enemy breaches our line. So it's very important to know that. Yet you can also see how critical that reserve force is from the defense in conducting any of these things. It mitigates our risk, it gives us greater options, and it helps us to reinforce gaps in our defense. So super critical, and that's how we think of a counterattack from the defense. But I also said there can be a counterattack from the offense, and that's true. Let's look at one. So let's switch sides. So here's the enemy's defense. It's their flot, and here's our enemy forces, and we're going to attack this. We're on the giving side, giving end, right? Instead of on the receiving end. And we attack. Yay. The attack is a deliberate attack. That's a whole different kind of tactic, and we're going to explore that at length. But for right now, let's just say that we create a gap in their lines. Yay, we punched through. Now we can conduct a counterattack. Believe it or not, the attack achieves its first objective, which is breaking through. Now we need to follow on. And a follow on, we have several different options, or at least two. One is a pursuit. A pursuit is, once we break this, if the enemy starts to, and even if they don't, if they start to run away bravely, right? They start, okay, they're out of here. They're going in their lines of egress. They're falling back. However they do that, they can do it in mass hysteria, or they may have executed a really well thought out retrograde delay. Or they may say, no, I'm going to stay right here and I'm going to fight to the death. In any case, whether they're going to fight to the death, we can send forces to the rear, and now we have that whole hammer and anvil thing going. See that? Oh yeah, we can do that. We can start seizing and destroying and capturing enemy in detail because we've broken through. Or we can pursue them, right, as they run away. And we can do that again, probably a double envelopment. We're going to try and catch them out there and then push through. The enemy are the target. That's the critical aspect of a pursuit, is the enemy personnel are the main objective. We want to destroy them, we want to capture them, and we want to defeat them. Simple enough, a pursuit. We create a gap in the enemy's line and then conduct a pursuit. And how do we conduct that pursuit? Well, if you're looking at this is starting to look a whole lot like movement to contact, search and attack, particularly out here. This is a search and attack. Well, that's one form of movement to contact, search and attack, but there's another one, right? The approach march. Would you use an approach march from this? And the answer is yes. That's called an exploitation. So pursuit, the objective is get the enemy, get the enemy's personnel, degrade their force, conquer them. An exploitation seeks to, once we have this gap, we seek terrain. I don't know, it can be anything. Let's say there's high ground back here, right? Ooh, and we can dominate the battle space from that high ground. So now, from here, we might send a couple of vanguards forward and the rest of the body follows, and there you go, approach march. That's a movement to contact. Our vanguard's forward, everybody else follows, and we seize terrain. It can be not just terrain, it can be some kind of facility, it could be a road junction, a town that has a road junction. One of the famous ones is the Battle of the Bulge, right? Bastogne had, who knew how many trains and roads coming through it, and so it was a critical asset that, of course, the German army wanted after they had broken through our initial defenses. And so you can see, you can go for a resource like a town or road junction or a harbor or anything like that. So you can look at facilities. Last thing you can exploit is you can exploit resources. We can break through the enemy, go back and get their fuel supply and either capture or destroy it. Why? Because we know the enemy is low on fuel, we know where their fuel supply is, let's go get it and destroy it, deny it to the enemy. Or let's go capture it and use it ourselves, right? So that's a resource. And that would be an exploitation. Again, the initial attack breaks the enemy's line, creates a gap, and then we move through that gap to exploit terrain, facility, or resource. The last one I'm going to say about that resource is people are a resource, at least within certain types of warfare. I'm going to argue maybe they're always a resource, but the civilian, green layer, if I can use esoteric military term, the civilian population in insurgencies and counterinsurgencies, both sides really are struggling over legitimacy, right? Who do the people see as legitimate? And so when you breach, either figuratively or literally, when you breach the enemy's lines and then your force moves through to exploit, you could be exploiting support from good guys. Think about this one. This isn't too hard to recall, and most people know their history. So when the Allies got into France, very much they were seeking support from the French population, right? In more ways than one, but also in terms of military action. And they needed the population to rise up and have the confidence to rise up. So their initial toehold, on D-Day and several weeks into that, really inspired the French people to rise up against the German occupiers. And so once again, you see, there you go. They're exploiting their success to garner support from the French people. It can be that simple, right? And likewise, inside of terrorism, your hybrid threat or your full spectrum of operation terrorisms, guerrilla warfare, insurgent warfare, certainly your opponents will exploit this. They'll use information and they'll exploit the population, garnering support from them by either saying what terrible dastardly deeds you did as you won your victory. You're just a bunch of, atrocious monsters and everybody should support the insurgency. Something to this effect. That's very, very common. Here we have it. We have follow-on and transitional operations and follow-on tactics. And once again, you see that movement to contact is the default tactic we use. We can do that from the defense in different forms of counterattack. We can do this from the offense in different forms of continued attack in terms of pursuit and exploitation. I think that's just about all I'm going to say for a little while about movement to contact.